Session times and Google. Let's talk about it today with James Gardner, the CineTechGeek. Getting session times into Google and why it's so important. Part 1. Now, the reason I'm doing a two-parter, because as I go along, you'll see why I've only got part of the story, because there's still a lot to be discussed, and you'll discover why as I go through the presentation. And I want to go through why it's so important in this day and age of why we need to get our session times into Google. Now, just to go over what this actually means, an example. If you've got a mobile phone, or even a web browser for that fact, but mobile phones traditionally, because that's what most people are using for this these days, and you type in session times or show times into Google, you'll get what's called a carousel of images. This works for also recipes and other things like people, etc. And it's called the Google Knowledge Graph, where Google searches for knowledge and tries to represent it to you in a contextual and meaningful way. So if you put show times in it, obviously it's trying to show you the latest releases that are around you in your geolocation that you may be interested in. Of course, if you then now click on one of those posters, you'll now get more information about that movie, including the social, what it's doing on Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, etc. But immediately after that, you've got what's called show times. And that's going to show you the cinemas that are around you and the session times they have that for that particular film. So that's very important, of course, because getting the people to know when a film is on and where to go is really half the battle, isn't it? So getting your session times into Google is very important because of this. So just think about that in some traditional ways. Before the internet was so prolific, etc., we had the newspapers, and if you couldn't put your sessions into the newspaper, no one knew when to come to see your movies at your cinema or what movies are on. Today we know we've got the website, and that's very important, but we've also got search. So how do people find you on the website? Do people who are just going around, are they looking for a particular website, or are they looking for a movie? Well, if they're looking for a movie, you really want to be in search, because that's where they search. So like here, websites are only half the answer. You need to really be actively, on the searching, make sure your search and your knowledge graph data in Google is all up to date and correct, and you're part of that solution for the people looking for a movie to view. Now, why is it so important? Well, attendance is not matching population growth in established markets. Still a lot of growth in certain parts of the world. Now let's look at Australia. I'm from Australia, so I know the numbers there quite well. And here's Screen Australia, some numbers here, and it's got from 2001 to 2017, and you'll see in the last column the frequency. So it's the frequency. Well, that's the average number of time someone goes to a film in a year. And you'll see over the last many years, it is slowly going down. And in the last year, in 2017 from 2016, it's a significant, it was I think a 6.7% drop in attendance. That's a bit of a worry, because that's a trend, and a trend going down is not a trend we like. So we need to look at why that might be happening. And one of those reasons, and it's quite well known, that the biggest demographic that is not coming to the cinema anymore is the younger demographic. Right? So in other words, it's these people, they live on their phone. So if you're not on their phone, are you in their life? They also, they do things together through their phones. So if you're not in this context, are you in their life? Are you in their lifestyle? So the young live through their mobile phones. If going to the movies is not convenient, and so I've underlined it, I've coloured it, I've put inverted commas around it, it's that important. A click away, it should be a click away on their mobile phone. It's their lifestyle, it's how they live, right? So you need to be part of this lifestyle. That's why it's so important. I just want to really nail that in there, because what's coming up is important. You need to get on top of it. So it's important as an exhibitor. What do I need to do to get onto Google search? Okay, that's the real question here. Not a lot, but before we continue, changes are coming. So I wanted to go over the changes so have an idea of what's coming and how it's getting better and more applicable to those people. we need to understand the current limitations and what to expect in the future. So there are some limitations on how it's being done today. And in part 2, I hope to go over more of that, as it's a bit, Google sort of announced this recently in this next slide. Google will announce upcoming improvements posted in April 2018. So this is, if you look at that link, Google on their search blog posted an announcement that they're going to be introducing a number of new features, and this is their example from their webpage of some of the new features. And specifically, the features that are coming, which are very welcome, is the type of session support. Is not well supported in the current implementation. So there's a lot of examples of where you might have a cinema listed twice as cinema and cinema gold class, because you want to be able to know the difference between the sessions. If they're all bunched together, how do you know if you're looking at it, if the session is for a gold class session or some alternative session? And in this era of 3D Atmos, premium large format, motion chairs, that problem's significantly worse, and it needs to be addressed with the searching online. Secondly, going along with the convenience factor, a direct click through to purchase of the tickets. So that's, you'll see in the demonstration here where you've got, you can see the different types of movies and the times. You can click on a time and it'll take you to the exact the landing page for the ticket purchase for that particular session at that particular time at that particular location. So convenience here is the key, and this is a very convenient, if a young person has an idea he wants to go to the movies, you want it to be as frictionless as possible that he purchased that ticket, so he's got a commitment to that ticket. So again, convenience is the key. Convenience. I'd just like to remind people how things like Netflix, these other medias which are, challenging the cinema industry, they've done very well because of their convenience. And we as a cinema industry have to take note of that and try and make not just the experience great, but the convenience of actually achieving that experience of going to that experience as seamless and as frictionless as possible too. So let's have a look at how it is done. At the current state of play, this isn't so good. Google does not follow its own documented procedure when it comes to exhibition data. If you follow the code, the Google development documentation and schema.org, etc., and you'll see a lot of mention of these carousels and how that data gets into what they call their knowledge graph. And schema.org is a way of representing data that Google can absorb as it does its searching, so it can fill out that information on recipes, on people, like on Wikipedia. When you do a search on something and it comes up with a Wikipedia card on the side, that's using the structured data coming from defined as schema.org, and Google is using that to put it into their search results. Well, that's, if reading the documentations, you expect that's probably what's supposed to be happening with Cinema Times too. They'd be taking it from your websites, and the websites would be generating structured data to read it. That's not what happens. I know I spent like 2 or 3 months writing a WordPress plugin specifically around these, suggested documentations, and I got it all working, and I jumped up and down for quite a while before someone bothered to tell me, actually, Guy, it doesn't work that way. I was a bit angry about that, because I was hoping to make this plugin open source, because I think this is an important part. I don't make so many videos these days for CineTechGeek, so my contribution these days is trying to actually bring some of this innovation and the technology and moving with the times to allow cinemas to take advantage of some of these things and how they happen. Instead of that, what's happened is Google has appointed certain companies that cover specific regions. These companies write software to scrape cinema websites. So likely a historic reason before cinemas had websites. So when Google started the search engine and cinema was still in newspapers, etc., what happened a lot of the times is these companies were probably looking at the newspaper and typing it into the systems. Now, obviously, with cinemas now getting on board with making websites, etc., there's software now to scrape those websites so they can automate that process. And in some cases, and this is what you should do, because of the following reason. So doing a general scraper of a website or just typing it in is a little bit prone to error. But you can contact these companies and you can supply them a proper structured data source, like from a point of sale or an API key to a back-end cloud system that may be looking after your session times. There's many ways to do it, and they'll usually you'll be able to tell them, I'm this sort of way, and they'll ask for the right data, they'll slot it in, and it's all done, and the data's much more reliable. But I still find they only scrape it at certain times, so if you change your data, that could, you do occasionally have to change it because of issues, etc. That may not make it into the update, so you've got to keep those things in mind. Now, example of what not to do. So when I started doing the research on this, I contacted a few people and say, well, how does this happen? How does it get into Google? And this is one of the responses I got back. It's the biggest mystery. This is from an exhibitor, a friend of mine. The closest I could ever get is that they crawl our website for times, which is true. Recently, they have been more accurate, but a few years ago, they were very appallingly wrong. I could never find a way to communicate my disgust to them. Even now, we tell our patrons not to use Google, but to go to our website if they want correct information. Now, I nearly fell off my chair when I saw this. Google's supposed to be a data company, and this sort of stuff was happening. But anyway, I suppose historically the way it was done, it's sort of still that way, and we sort of need to move forward. But in other words, avoid this scenario. If this is happening to you, what you want to do is contact one of these anointed companies. I'll try and have a list below under this in the text describing the video with the anointed companies I know or have discovered for particular regions, and a contact email, and contact them, and they're usually very helpful, and they'll just get it all sorted out for you if you're having issues, etc. So that's what I expect you should do now, but let's just have a little bit of a deeper look at other aspects of it. Other must-dos, add cinema to Google Maps, because obviously if Google's going to do contextual results on geolocation, it needs to know where you are on the map and have information about your website. And if you know about Google, you know that there's a page called business.google.com/locations, and in there you can actually register your locations, the type of business, the opening hours, etc. And Google needs all that data that goes into its knowledge graph, so it knows how to display that information contextually to you. Like for example, an example of that is, so I'm going to this shop, and it'll come up, that shop will be closed before you get there. That sort of cleverness is coming from this knowledge graph, and Google loading this sort of data, you programming it into them through programming a business here. This is one of my cinemas here where I've programmed, if you type the name Forbes Cinema, it comes up with that location, some session times there for that location because it's part of its knowledge graph, and on the side there it's got pictures and other bits and pieces, and that's coming from joining this. Or adding your data into this part of Google, into business.google.com/locations. And it's very good. They do proper certification of who you are when you register. They send you that you actually have to get something physically mailed out to your location with a number on it to certify that you actually own that location. All these sort of things. So there's a lot of due diligence and other things happening there to make sure the data is correct. But that's a must-do if as part of this process. Business considerations. Okay, so I wanted to talk about here what's currently done and there's business considerations. So what Google want to do and what's currently happening with these anointed companies. So let's talk about that. There are many industry sectors that have a stake in what happens here. All right. So it's if someone controls how people find session times and movies they want to see, that's a powerful position to be in. What is best for the industry as a whole and not what is best for a specific sector should be our aim. So let me give an example of this. For example, in some established markets there are, for example, large ticket selling entities, and they would prefer that if you want to see a film that they don't just type it into Google, that they think of that company and going through that entity, and through that entity you might purchase the tickets. that's a business advantage for them, and there's that's good for them. But is it good for the many independent cinemas out there who have to, they will want some sort of cut for that service, right? So there's invested interest and conflicts of interest going on here. So I expect one of the reasons why we are still a little bit behind in how we're doing this, as you'll discover, is because there's some business interests and other discussions in place, or taking place still. So I've discussed with some people that during my research, that these sort of activities are happening, or discussions are happening. Now, the problem with this is that it's opaque. No idea what is happening inside the anointed companies. So you're pushing the data into the anointed companies, and that's all you really, that's it. That's all you know, and you just hope it shows up in Google. Doesn't sound the best. There's no accountability. If it displays it incorrectly, there's no one to call. There's no one to complain. There is nothing you can do. There's no documented API, how it works. There's no way to test if it's working correctly. This is all very strange, because if you're doing your website and you're doing SEO, there's tools from Google like website tools, etc., webmaster tool sets, etc., from Google to test how it's going, how they're scraping or crawling the site and putting it into the search engine. There's lots of data and analytics you can find out to make sure everything's working correctly. Well, currently there's nothing like that for putting your session times into the knowledge graph. It's just these anointed companies, you send it to them, or they scrape it from you, and that's all you know. So that's probably not the best, and we probably need to move on from that into something a little bit more accountable. Like, who is Google servicing? People doing the searching, or companies buying ads who have an invested interest in how and what people find? These questions need to be they need some clarification. That's a reasonable. It's a reasonable request. Likely outcomes. Likely outcomes. Now, in the past, Google's been snapped on the fingers for doing a few little things which look a little bit strange, and one could see this lack of transparency in the current way things are done as a red flag to a bull in terms of, do you want to attract the attention of some regulators? And that would be my suggestion to Google, that the current way of doing things is probably not it's not a good idea going forward, especially with in recent years, the governments have become more and more critical about accountability and transparency with these big companies, and the fact that there is none when it comes to session times getting into Google is probably not a strategically long-term good idea for them to do. I just wanted to point that out here. So that's one of the reasons I expect things to change, and why there'll be likely a part 2 when we find out what those changes are, and I'll put some more information up about them. So likely implementations, let's get geeky. So we've got these extra requirements of the session type and direct ticket purchase. Those are the two very straightforward known things you want to implement. Structured data, as is suggested to be used by Google for a lot of the things they already do, such like it's happening with Webedia, etc. I don't really think it's that suitable for what we as a cinema industry need, for a number of reasons. Some of those reasons are that we need a more controlled way of pushing data into the knowledge graph, because unfortunately we do have to update the data occasionally, not often, but occasionally we do, and there needs to be a way to trigger that, to push that data into the knowledge graph when it changes, because incorrect data coming out of there is not always good. Is not what we desire, because it could lead to a poor outcome for a moviegoer, and that's something we want to avoid. One of the things I'd like to see is a dedicated and industry-approved API would be my recommended preference, right? And what I mean by that, I'd like to get some industry, like maybe this is happening, I'm out of the loop. I've tried to contact Google a number of times and get some more information about this, but unfortunately have failed to get any responses. But I'm heavily involved with ISDCF and some other technical sides of cinema exhibition, and They are like ICCF, for example, is a body, that represents the distributors, exhibitors, and specifically the service companies which fill all in the gaps between them, being POS, TMS, and other suppliers. Now, the best thing here is that those suppliers who write all this software which services our industry would have some sort of API to work with that would automatically expose this data in a specific predefined way to Google or whoever, if it's still the United Companies, whatever happens, and it's just all automatic, and this data can flow out of the cinemas pretty simply. I'd also like to mention that when we first did this, when this first happened, and the United Companies were needed because cinemas just had no idea about websites, etc. Well, today that's all changed. Most cinemas have a good handle on their website, have good developers on their website, implementing an API or an endpoint that Google can grab onto with a specific set out design of structured data would be very easy for them to implement. It's one of the reasons I was working on my own open source version, because it would have been a template that either, if you had WordPress, you could possibly use straight out of the box, or if you had your own custom system, the source code's all in the WordPress plugins. You just can cut and paste it into your own website and get it all done, and make sure that we are servicing that younger demographic which we are failing to get to the cinema. And that's my goal here, is to try and think of ways as a CineTechGeek to grab that audience back and make sure that the cinema culture is not lacking in the younger generation. And one of the other ways I would prefer to see this, in the last slide, my suggestion on this implementation, when we actually programmed into the business.google.com, you program all this data, like when you open your address, etc. And one of the things you need to do is you need to label your site of what it is, what it does. And label it as a movie theatre or cinema. What I'd like to see is, if you do that, Google opens up a specific API key for those locations where if you are that type of location in Google Business, you then have access to an endpoint with an API key to push that data straight in whenever you want. If you change it, the vendors can write it into their point of sale, or the TMSs, bang, 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 and you can easily just, by programming your site into the maps, because you have to do that if you want this to work anyway, you have a location where you can push it in. And also, I'd like to see some tools to make sure that what we push in is what's coming out, and some ways to easily do searches, etc., to understand what's going on. You can sort of do that if you're sort of a bit into your web, etc. There are some tools like overriding your geolocation in Google Chrome, etc., to do some tests, which is something, if you're interested, contact me and I'll show you how. So that would, for example, to emulate someone doing a search for a session sitting on top of your cinema should show up, shouldn't it? Well, if it doesn't, there's a problem, and there's something you need to know, that you now need to do something about, and now you need to do something about it, because there's not really any real predefined way to make those tests and to assure yourself that that data is in there and it's coming out correctly for your cinema. So I'd like to see some tools from Google on that, and other ways to do that. And the other reason I'm interested in doing this is because we can, as a cinema, like I said before, push the data in when it changes, if there's a problem, if there's all those sort of aspects, or the data has some update in that data, we can quickly replicate it into the Google search results. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this discussion or this presentation was informative to you, and if you have any questions, please get on to me, and I'll try and answer them as soon as I can. Anyway, that's James Gardner, the CineTechGeek, on getting your session times into Google, and hopefully we'll be back with a part 2 covering the new features as Google rolls them out. Bye for now.